listeners, and welcome to another episode of Open Book, Open Mind. I'm your host, Edgar Chaput. Open Book, Open Mind is the show where I discuss books that I've read recently, or authors, or styles, or series, publications, what have you. Remember, dear listeners, on this show, we don't have to like the book. We just have to keep an open mind and give it a try. This week, we're switching it up again, just a little bit. I don't necessarily want to talk about a single book, which I've done a few times. I want to talk about a concept and use an example to analyze that concept. That is the idea of continuation novels for a highly regarded sort of global IP. In this case, James Bond, written by Ian Fleming, who wrote 12 novels, 2 collections of short stories from the early 1950s to the mid 1960s, or actually I should say early 1960s, because he did pass away in 1964. And since then, there have been multiple continuation authors. Some have written just single books, others have written a handful of books, and at least at the time of this recording, in sometime in spring 2025, there is now a current continuation author who is putting their own spin on things. I'm referring to Kim Sherwood, a English author who also teaches. She teaches in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and she also lives there. And she's the most recent hiree of the Ian Fleming estate to write some continuation novels. She has written 2 thus far. It's my understanding the plan is that there's supposed to be a trilogy of books. Her first book, Double or Nothing, came out in 2022, at least originally here in North America. I think it was in the spring of 2023. And its immediate sequel, A Spy Like Me, was released globally in 2024. Now, I'm not necessarily going to spend several minutes on Kim Sherwood's backstory and where she's from, her history as an author, and her academic journey. She gave quite a few very, very solid interviews, most notably when the first of her 2 books, Double or Nothing, was released. She's obviously a very big fan of James Bond. She's a humongous fan of Ian Fleming's original work. And so she's tasked with this continuation novel. And I want to talk about the idea of continuing an IP after either the original creator has long since deceased, or maybe in the case of George Lucas, selling their IP off to another company, another entity. The responsibility that falls on that individual's shoulders, in this case Sherwood, is quite heavy. Heaviest is the crown. And right now, Kim Sherwood is the queen of the James Bond literary universe. And what happened in her instance, or I guess I should say what is happening, because at the time of this recording, the 3rd book is unreleased. We don't even really have that many details about the 3rd book. Not unclear when that one's coming out. But nevertheless, in her conversations with the Fleming estate, it was proposed to modernize the franchise. In other words, her stories do not take place during Fleming's time. They take place in the modern day. There are even very fleeting references to events that happened not too long ago. So it's obviously the modern day. The technology in the books obviously suggests that it's the modern day, the 21st century, the 2020s to be specific. But her continuation novels, this trilogy, goes one step beyond, in the sense that the basic premise of her stories is that James Bond, 007, has gone missing. He may even be dead. We're not sure. And it's up to the rest of the Double O's, by way of completing their own missions, to try, if they can, determine what did happen to James Bond. And if there are enough clues to suggest that he is still among the living, well, where is he located? Who has kidnapped him? So this is really swinging for the fences in an unorthodox way, an unexpected way. Generally, these continuation novels will at least make use of the original character, or if the protagonists, if there are multiple protagonists, a group of or a team of protagonists, those characters will be the focal point of the continuation project. Whereas in this instance, that's actually not the case. Other than a few flashbacks in the first book and a couple fleeting references to James Bond in the second book, Bond is not present. He's nowhere to be found, quite simply put. And so this is a big ask, one of the author, but also on the reader. There still is a James Bond fan base out there, and obviously for the Fleming estate to agree to try to make a trilogy out of this idea. Well, they also believe that they can sell enough books after publishing 3 of them. They can sell enough copies, that is to say, that'll be worthwhile. But it is a big ask. It's tough to expect a James Bond fan to readily and immediately dive into a trilogy of stories that mostly don't feature the character they probably want to follow when they pick up a book that takes place in the universe of James Bond. It's a big ask. And there are a lot of challenges on not just taking on the legacy of Fleming's creation, but doing so in such a way. The most obvious challenge, and one made all the more difficult by choosing to not utilize the character of 007, is to satisfy the expectations of the readership. Anyone who's read Fleming's novels, and frankly the continuation novels as well, there are certain expectations. The villain has to be kind of megalomaniacal, a little bit off the beaten path. There needs to be some strong female characters, some strong male characters. There has to be some cloak and dagger involved, some fisticuffs, some gunfights, vehicles. The characters need to travel to multiple locations. Now, those are the general expectations when one picks up a James Bond novel, be it the original Fleming timeline or anything that came afterwards. And in this particular instance, Sherwood, the author, is trying to satisfy those expectations with brand new characters, brand new double O's, and trying to forge a new road ahead, a new road forward by expanding this world. And that's a monumental challenge. If it doesn't work, it's entirely on the author. Well, maybe that's not quite accurate. It's on the author and also on the publishing house, because and it is the Yin Fleming estate. They do have say on what gets published and what doesn't. And since they agreed to this idea and thought it was a good idea to make a trilogy of it, and also the responsibility is also on their shoulders as well, to be fair. And so what happens in this series of books, at least through the first 2, I don't see why it wouldn't be the case in the final installment, is that we don't have one protagonist, we have multiple protagonists. There are 2 to 3 double O's, maybe 4 in total. One of them doesn't show up as much in the sequel, and another double O who wasn't really present in the first one is more present in the sequel. So let's say 3 to 4 double O's who are completely new creations, although some of their names and backstories are, how would I put it, doves of the cap to the universe of James Bond, both cinematic and literary. One of the double O's name is Joanna Harwood, and for those who don't know, and I wouldn't blame you for not knowing this, you kind of have to be a bit of a Bond fanatic to know this, but Joanna Harwood was a screenwriter who lended a hand on the writing of the first 2 films, those being Dr. No and From Russia with Love. So and in this trilogy of books, she is a double O. So there are these little nods to the universe, to the multiverse of James Bond. And I would say that among the things that work are the characters. I think by and large, the double O's are quite interesting. They do feel like fully fledged characters. They feel three-dimensional enough that they're engaging, they're sufficiently engaging to tag along with on these missions, these missions, death-defying adventures, throughout which villains must be stopped, and the villains in question may or may not have something to do with James Bond's disappearance. So they're quite well realized. The prose is also very good. Not prose as in P-R-O-S, but P-R-O-S-E. The actual prose in these novels is very good, which I suppose is to be expected. English authors, from what I can tell, and obviously I haven't read every book written by every English author evs, but English authors just seem to have a very impressive command of the English language, which I guess shouldn't sound too surprising, but I do find there is a distinction to be made between reading something written by an Englishman or an Englishwoman or a Scot or an Irish man or an Irish woman, and reading something maybe by a Canadian author or who writes in English, or an American author who writes in English. And that's not to say that Canadian and American authors don't write well. Some of them write incredibly well. But the manipulation of the English language, I suppose from my tastes, more often than not all the time, but more often than not, just comes off as a little bit more refined. So her prose is very good, as is the action, of which there is a considerable amount in these books. I wasn't expecting there to be as much action in these novels. In fact, the first book in particular, of the two, between Double or Nothing and A Spy Like Me, I would say the action sequences are a bit stronger in Double or Nothing. Not that they're not good in A Spy Like Me, but I think they're more memorable. There's one in particular, I believe it is in fact involving Joanna Harwood and Felix Leiter, who's a name I'm sure Bond fans will recognize, and they're taking cover and whilst engaged in a sniper battle across a lake in Germany. And it's one of the best things in both books combined. It is really an extraordinarily tense and well devised and well written sequence. Also, I would say another one of the positives is, and this one's a little bit tricky, but the manner in which some of the characters we already know of, how they have evolved. Moneypenny is in these books. She's graduated. She's not just M's secretary anymore. She's actually managing stuff. She is kind of a head of section in her own right, in this modern universe. There is a Q lab. I don't want to give too much away. There is a Q lab, and there is a Q The way they deal with that character is surprising. It's never in a million years would I have necessarily guessed how Sherwood would reintroduce the modern Q. It's definitely different, but interesting. I'll give her that much. It's interesting. Bill Tanner is present at least a little bit in the first book, and I do find it interesting how some of the old fan favorites, how their journeys, how their careers and their character arcs have evolved. And look, at the end of the day, these are still stories that take place in the universe of James Bond, and for that reason, well, the reader should, rightfully so, expect a story told at a very fast clip with sexy locations, or at least sufficiently exotic and mesmeric locations at a fast pace. Sometimes the plots of the details don't always have to be super clear, because I think at the end of the day, what we're interested in is the adventure itself and not always all the specific minutiae. And in that respect, I think Kim Sherwood actually does quite a good job. That being said, I think Double or Nothing is a bit more... It seems to be resting on slightly more solid ground than A Spy Like Me. There's maybe a slight whiff of, the infamous middle chapter. You announce a trilogy that's going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, we don't know what the end of this trilogy is because the third book has not been published. We certainly know the beginning. And I find maybe A Spy Like Me has a little bit of that second album syndrome, where it needs to kind of still do the same thing as the first book, but it can't do exactly the same thing as the first book. And it also can't complete the story because it's part 2 of a trilogy. And I think maybe for that reason, and again, to be clear, I enjoyed A Spy Like Me. I think it's good. I think it's solid. But not quite as good, not quite as solid as Double or Nothing. There's a freshness to Double or Nothing. And I think in order to keep things fresh, Kim Sherwood maybe stretches further than her reach. I'm trying to remember if that's the exact expression, or she's biting off more than she can chew. She's juggling too many balls. Pick one of those expressions. The plotting, and I know a few moments ago I said that the plot in something like a James Bond novel doesn't need to be airtight. It's not always what the reader is focusing entirely on. The action and the sweep of the project is largely what should carry it from the reader's perspective. But we can still appreciate a good plot. We can still appreciate a plot that's well constructed, and I think Double or Nothing's plot is a bit simpler to follow. It certainly has stylistic touches that I'm sure would make Ian Fleming smile. I don't think he's rolling over in his grave when these 2 books come out, but maybe The Spy Who Loved Me, my goodness, there's a Freudian slip. Spy Like Me is a bit on the convoluted side. Just a bit on the convoluted side. I must admit that when new chapters began in A Spy Like Me, and, character X was arriving in location Z, I couldn't always remember why they were there and what they were trying to accomplish, which wasn't the case in Double or Nothing. I think Double or Nothing is a simpler plot. And by that extent, by that logic, maybe a bit more engaging. Possibly something else that might not strike every reader's fancy is I don't want to give too much away, but the deep emphasis, or at least relatively deep strong emphasis on the interpersonal relationships between the double O's, and in some instances between the double O's and Moneypenny. Not, and it's not that the Flemings never took interpersonal relationships seriously. If anything, the Flemings bond, as that series goes along, becomes more humane. He becomes a bit more three-dimensional, which is a great thing. And Sherwood definitely takes that to heart, and then some, as the expression goes. And maybe she lays it on a bit thick with how certain double O's behave with one another, and how their histories influence how they handle their missions and how they handle certain challenges, be them emotional or psychological. And some of what I'm referring to might relate to the imprint that James Bond has left on the double O section. Again, I'm not suggesting that is not something that anyone taking on the mantle of the literary James Bond can do. As I said a moment ago, even Fleming's Bond became increasingly three-dimensional as the series went along, with a few, very strong emotional beats along the way, it must be noted. But Sherwood certainly puts a decent amount of emphasis on that. Maybe just a smidgen too much. Even I didn't always buy what was going on as far as the interpersonal relationships, or at least it maybe if it wasn't that I wasn't buying it, it was maybe more the case where I wasn't quite certain why certain decisions were made, other than maybe an assumption that the modern reader needs stories to be more emotionally based, demands and expects modern stories to be richer in emotion. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I'm just spitballing here. This is nothing more than a hypothesis. But as someone who has read a decent amount of Fleming and even some of the continuation novels, I was surprised at how much the emotionality of the story seemed to be ever present and honestly drive a lot of the character motivations. All that being said, I was pleasantly surprised. I recall when this project was announced, I was dubious. A trio of books where James Bond is mostly absent. I thought that was a curious way to expand the James Bond universe, or at least to keep it alive, by not using the central figure. That was a bit odd. But I think Sherwood is such a good writer. Her prose is so good, and her understanding of Fleming's world and updating it mostly successfully to the 2020s. I'm still going to give both of these books a pass. Maybe Double or Nothing a bit of a higher pass than A Spy Like Me, but they are two pieces of a whole after all. So I'm going to say this series is pretty good, and I'm actually interested to see what happens next. Again, at the time of this writing in spring 2025, there's no news at all in when this third book is coming out. It doesn't have a title, but TBD. We'll see what happens. But yes, kudos to Sherwood for, at least for the most part, swinging for the fences. And is it a grand slam? Maybe not, but it's like a really good double or a really good triple. She's a runner in scoring position, and all that's required now is for the third book to bring her to home plate. there you have it. That was a little discussion about Kim Sherwood's James Bond continuation novels, Double or Nothing and A Spy Like Me, the first two chapters in a trilogy, a modern trilogy, a modern world, modern day interpretation of Ian Fleming's James Bond. I've been your host, Edgar Chaput. I hope you enjoyed these episodes. I certainly enjoy recording them. I'm still kind of finding my voice. I've never really done a podcast about books before, so I apologize if some of these episodes don't always feel as structured as they could be. But this one was certainly interesting. I do like James Bond books. I do like James Bond movies, and this was such a curious project. To say nothing of just the general fact that, continuation novels and taking on the mantle of legacy IPs is always a challenge and fertile ground for controversy, especially with maybe some of the more hardline fan bases out there. That I didn't pick up these books immediately when they came out. I did wait a little bit, but I'm glad I did. And I'm glad I recorded this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. This has been Open Book, Open Mind, and we'll catch you next time. Take care.